February 25th, 2012. We had record high temperature yesterday. The grass I planted last year is just taken off on my balcony. I have this tall variegated grass that I got from my mom. You know, I was thinking this morning, and there was someone that posted on Facebook quote of a spiritual leader. And it's a wonderful, warm-heartening quote. Basically it says, you know, with all the science and education and everything, it's important to stay rooted in the heart. Basically be loving. And I immediately felt protective. And I didn't know what this was about. And then I thought, in my mind, my little perception of a book that was written by, I think, Blavatsky. And this book talks about pleasure states. And it was written by a couple, a man and a woman, a married couple. And they were talking about how we protect ourselves, and we have these defensive mechanisms, and that if we feel vulnerable, we do not surrender to the pleasure state. And the key in their perspective, I think, was surrender. Surrendering to the pleasure state. And I think the female had a little more to say in the book than the male, to try to drive home the perspective of the female. And she was saying how the female feels vulnerable, can feel vulnerable. She doesn't always feel vulnerable, but she can feel vulnerable. And in her vulnerability, if she feels vulnerable, she doesn't want to surrender to the pleasure state, the state of pleasure. And I don't know if this is necessarily, I don't want to get too much into male and female differences and all that stuff when it comes to pleasure. I mean, I can recognize in myself, you know, when I feel, you know, protective and defensive, I don't want to surrender. I don't want to necessarily, it's not my natural inclination to surrender. And as I was thinking about this, I realized that in my experience, I have experienced women project this preoccupation with trying to get me and other males, because I've observed women that I'm not related to in any way, to try to lead the man into an emotional state. And this leading of men into emotional states is very empowering, can feel very, very empowering. And, you know, I think men can do this too. But we're not so much leading people into, men do not so much want to lead people into emotional states so much as constructive endeavors. And it was just coming to my mind that control, wanting to feel in control, wanting to control a situation so that we can feel safe. And in our safety, we can surrender to our pleasure. Pleasure requiring a state of vulnerability, being vulnerable. This was very influential. The books by them were very influential, their ideas, because this control, I realized so many people were desiring to have a pleasure state, but they refused to surrender to it. They had to control the situation in order to produce pleasure. So in order to have pleasure, they had to be in control. However, pleasure at its deepest levels, its most intense states, we lose control. And then I started looking at the stuff of the world, the events of the world, and I realized, we're struggling and struggling and struggling to control so much so that we can lose control in that state of pleasure. But as far as what I read yesterday, just that little post, it got me thinking, how much pleasure are you willing to surrender yourself to? And what is your natural inclination in that surrender? And this has been very interesting to me. How do people surrender to their pleasure, and how much can they surrender and be able to experience pleasure? Some people may only be able to experience a certain amount of pleasure. Too much pleasure and they can go a bit crazy, lose their minds. Ultimately, in the highest state of pleasure, we no longer are concerned about where we're at, the room we're in, the building we're in, the road we're on, in the town we're in the country we're in. When we are in a complete pleasure state, space falls away. And the same with time. Time falls away as well. And I came to understand that at that spiritual height, space and time both fall away. And it's not so much that space and time cease, the concerns for space and time fall away.